There is a church in the northern quarter of Cremona, small, narrow, and strangled by ivy so thick it swallows the daylight from its windows. Its wooden door has not been opened for decades, and yet, every so often, in the quietest hours before dawn, locals claim they can hear the faint rasp of a brush dragging across plaster from somewhere inside. The building is called Santa Lucia ad Fontes, though the name has long been erased from municipal records. What remains of it is more ruin than sanctuary, its walls buckled from damp, its altar fractured by neglect. But once, nearly 4 centuries ago, it was home to a fresco, so luminous that pilgrims would walk for days to kneel before it, the ceiling of the Ascension of the Choirs, painted by an artist whose name today no guidebook dares to print. In the year 1627, Cremona was not yet the quiet, agricultural town it is now. It was a city choked by the slow war between Spanish garrisons and the creeping reach of the Milanese plague. Death wagons clattered down the cobbled streets every other morning. Processions of monks in sackcloth carried relics to ward off contagion. In such days, art was one of the few refuges from the foulness of the world, and churches, no matter how small, competed for grandeur, as if beauty itself could serve as a barricade against mortality. The Council of Santa Lucia, desperate to revive attendance, sought a painter whose work could outshine the murals of the cathedral. His name, at least in the contracts preserved in the city archive, was recorded as Aurelio Dalmati, but there is no baptismal record of any Aurelio in Cremona, nor in Milan, Parma, or Florence. In fact, the trail of this man's life appears only in the brief years between 1627 and 1631, after which he vanishes entirely, except in the murmured warnings of later centuries. The earliest mention I have found lies in a letter from a Jesuit scholar to his superior in Rome. The ceiling is finished, yet the angels do not sing to heaven, but leer as if they hold some hidden jest. There is an odor in the chapel that no incense can mask. Aurelio arrived in Cremona alone, without apprentices or family. Witnesses described him as tall, sharply thin, and dressed in a coat that seemed more suited to a funeral than an artist's workshop. His voice, when he spoke, was courteous but strangely hollow, as though he rationed each word. He rented a loft above the tannery district, where the smell of hides masked whatever strange odors might seep from his work. The parish records show that, for the first months, he purchased great quantities of white lead, vermilion, and ultramarine, common enough for a muralist. But then, in the winter of 1628, the invoices begin to list more unusual items: powdered bone, clotted lime, lamb's blood. It was during this period that the city orphanage, just 2 streets from the tannery, began reporting disappearances. At first, only 1 or 2 children vanished over the course of a month, easy for the records to blame on illness or flight. But by spring, the numbers had swelled. Mothers whispered of shadows in the alleys, of a pale figure glimpsed carrying small, unmoving shapes wrapped in cloth. The bishop ordered prayers and tightened curfew, but the disappearances persisted. Meanwhile, the work at Santa Lucia advanced at an unnatural pace. Those who slipped inside to glimpse the ceiling before its unveiling swore the figures were unlike any saints or angels painted before. Their wings were vast and almost translucent, as if made from something brittle. Their eyes followed you from any corner of the chapel. The choir of heaven, Aurelio claimed, was to be painted in such detail that each angel would seem alive enough to breathe. One laborer, whose testimony survives in the inquisitorial margins, spoke of an evening when Aurelio asked him to assist in carrying a heavy crate into the chapel. The box, damp at the corners, left a dark trail across the stone floor. When the laborer asked what it contained, the painter replied, "The music of their bones." The man never returned to work. It is tempting to dismiss such accounts as superstition, a kind of rural hysteria amplified by the plague years. But when I obtained permission to enter the sealed chapel last winter, I saw with my own eyes what the centuries had tried to forget. The ceiling, though dimmed by soot and mildew, still blazed with the unnatural harmony of its composition. The angels leaned forward, their faces tender yet uncomfortably human, and in the soft curve of each cherubic cheek, beneath the pigment, there was a faint relief, a shadow of texture that did not belong to plaster alone. Running my fingers across the surface, I felt the fine ridges of something else, something that had once been alive. The church is silent now, the doors chained by the city's authority, but the smell lingers, a faint sweetness, like milk just turned to rot. the same scent the Jesuit had written about nearly 400 years ago. In the summer of 1628, the River Po receded under a heat so vicious that fish lay rotting on the banks, and the air grew thick with the perfume of decay. That was when Aurelio's nocturnal habits became impossible to ignore. The night watchmen swore they saw him return to the loft only in the hours before dawn. His gloves soaked dark, his boots leaving faint stains that even the dust could not disguise. And when the wind was right, it carried a sound from his window, not the scratch of brushes, but the slow, rhythmic rasp of a knife on bone. The orphanage ledger from that year survives in brittle pages, its ink bled by damp. On the margins, in a hand different from the keeper's, there are crude marks, tally lines that halt abruptly at the number 23. The official explanation given to the bishop was that the plague had struck the children hardest, yet the death cart did not carry their bodies, and no grave in the city holds them. There is only the memory of Sister Madonna's weeping, recorded in a clerk's note. She said they had been taken by the angels early. In Santa Lucia, the fresco reached its middle stages. Aurelio had begun to paint the central host, a swirl of angels rising into a burst of gold at the apex of the ceiling. But those who saw it before scaffolding concealed the view spoke of another detail: the skulls, not large, but small, almost hidden, woven into the folds of clouds and the curves of wings. Infants' skulls, they whispered, disguised among the flourishes so that one could believe it, a trick of the eye, until you counted them. It was the sacristan Lorenzo Viani who first dared to confront Aurelio. His testimony, preserved in the Inquisition's archive, reads like the diary of a man slipping into fever. He wrote that he found the painter one night standing in the candlelit chapel, a bundle of linen at his feet. Aurelio was unwrapping it slowly, speaking softly in a language Lorenzo did not recognize. Inside was the pale form of a child, hair shaved, eyes closed as if in sleep. Aurelio looked up and, with a smile that Lorenzo described as the smile of one greeting a guest at a feast, said, "He will sing forever now." After that night, Lorenzo could not bring himself to enter the chapel again, but the story began to circulate among the poorest quarters, not from his lips, but from the murmurs of mothers who had lost their children and seen Aurelio lingering near the wells. The painter, they said, had made a pact. He was building a choir for heaven, but heaven, in this case, was not God's domain. It was something else entirely, something that required the flesh and bone of the innocent. By autumn, the fresco was nearly complete, yet Aurelio's health seemed to sharpen rather than decline. In a time when plague stripped the city of color, he alone walked with a kind of fevered vitality. His eyes glittered too brightly in the half-light. His hands moved with the restless precision of one who never tires. Some whispered he had found the philosopher's stone. Others claimed he drank the marrow of the dead. All agreed on one point: he was not the same man who had first arrived in Cremona. Then came the day the scaffolding was removed, revealing the ascension of the choirs in its entirety. Those present, a handful of clergy, the church council, and several wealthy patrons, were struck into silence. The ceiling did not depict a distant, ethereal heaven, but one that leaned down toward the viewer, crowded with faces rendered so vividly they seemed on the verge of speech. Their wings shimmered with layered pigment that caught the light like living skin, and hidden within the golden halo of clouds were dozens of delicate, pale ridges, curved in such a way that once seen could never be unseen. One of the patrons, a merchant named Falieri, collapsed during the unveiling. He was carried outside, gasping that the angels had opened their mouths and called his name. The bishop, pale and sweating, declared the work a triumph, but his words were brittle, mechanical, like those of a man compelled to praise something he feared. That night, for reasons unrecorded, the church was closed to the public. Guards were posted at its doors, and Aurelio vanished from sight for several weeks. It is in this gap that the darkest rumors took root. Some said the painter had been arrested and held in the bishop's own residence. Others claimed he had been seen crossing the Po in a small boat, carrying a final crate toward the marshlands. But when winter came, Aurelio was back at his loft, and the chapel remained locked, its masterpiece hidden. I have often wondered what transpired in those weeks, whether the bishop confronted him, whether a bargain was struck, or whether the truth was simply too dangerous to release. For in that era, beauty was a currency, and the church could ill afford to destroy what might be its most haunting treasure, no matter its cost in blood. Yet the smell persisted. Even with the doors barred, Those who passed Santa Lucia swore they could scent it on the wind, a sweetness mingled with the faintest edge of iron, like breath over old coins. The same scent, centuries later, still lingers in the dust, and if you stand beneath that locked ceiling long enough, or so the caretakers whisper, you will begin to hear it too. The far-off harmony of children's voices, thin and pale, singing in a language no one living understands. The winter of 1628 sealed Cremona beneath a sky the color of pewter. Snow muffled the streets, cloaking the city in a silence that might have felt holy were it not for the rumors still crawling through its veins. The chapel of Santa Lucia remained locked, its masterpiece hidden behind doors that creaked like they resented being closed. But Aurelio did not vanish entirely. He was seen at dawn on the frozen riverbank, staring into the mist with a leather-bound book in his hands, his breath coiling into the air like faint incense smoke. That book, or one very like it, would surface decades later in the archive of a noble family in Parma, an artifact wrapped in oilcloth and sealed with red wax. Its pages were filled with Aurelio's hand, written in a mixture of Latin, vernacular, Italian, and a cipher so tangled it seemed the work of a mind both brilliant and unsound. The surviving scholars who have attempted to decipher it do not agree on much, but there is consensus on a few entries. They are written not in ink, but in pigment, vermilion mixed with something that, under the glass of analysis, revealed traces of calcium and marrow. One entry, marked with a flourish like a wing, reads, "They come to me in sleep, not as phantoms, but as children made whole, their eyes alight. I have given them shape in heaven. They have given me their voices." Another, more chilling, is nothing but a list of first names, followed by the Latin quantus eternus, eternal song. It was during this period that the final disappearances occurred. They were not the ragged street children this time, but the sons and daughters of merchants, even the nephew of a minor noble. Families offered coin to searchers, but none returned with news. What they did find, in alley gutters, in the frost beneath the walls, were tiny linen slippers, each bearing a smear of gold leaf, as if they had brushed against a painter's table. One night, near the feast of the Epiphany, a servant named Riccardo, who worked in the bishop's household, claimed to see Aurelio slipping through the churchyard with a bundle no larger than a loaf of bread. Riccardo followed, keeping to the shadows, and swore under oath that the painter knelt before the chapel door, whispered a prayer in a voice that sounded like two voices layered together, and vanished inside without touching the lock. Riccardo fled before he could see more. Whether this was cowardice or instinct, I will not judge. By early spring, something strange began to happen in the wealthiest homes of the city. The aging patrons who had funded Santa Lucia's restoration, men with skin like wax and coughs that rattled through the night, began to recover. Their cheeks pinked, their eyes cleared, their hands no longer trembled as they held their goblets. Some called it a miracle. Others, remembering the vanished children, muttered darker words, yet none refused the change. Life, after all, was sweeter than conscience. And in every account of these transformations, there is mention of a sound, faint at first, like the distant peal of bells. But as the weeks passed, the sound deepened, became more intricate, like a choir rehearsing somewhere just beyond the walls. Those who listened too long claimed the melodies wove themselves into dreams, until waking and sleeping became impossible to separate. It was during this unsettling prosperity that Aurelio unveiled a new work, not in the chapel, which remained closed, but in the salon of Countess Valiera, one of the city's most feared and admired figures. The painting was of an angel descending, its wings unfurled, not in white, but in translucent layers that seemed spun from threads of bone. In its arms it cradled an infant whose face was turned away. The Countess declared it the most divine thing she had ever seen. The guests, however, could not look for long. Beneath the delicate feathers of the wings were fine, repeating ridges, vertebrae, painted with such precision that no one could mistake them. That night, the Countess gifted Aurelio a ruby ring said to have belonged to her great-grandmother, and a letter of introduction to the Duke of Mantua. She told him his work deserved a greater audience, but Aurelio refused. "I have yet to finish the choir," he said, and his voice, according to one witness, was heavy with something that might have been longing or hunger. As spring bled into summer, the unease in Cremona reached a pitch. The bishop ordered the chapel open to a select group of clergy for inspection, perhaps fearing what might be whispered in Rome if the matter was left unresolved. But when they entered, the air was so heavy and sweet that several fainted before they reached the altar. Those who remained conscious swore they heard music, not of this earth. High, thin harmonies that seemed to pass through the skull rather than the ears. And on the ceiling, the angels' faces had changed. No longer serene, they now seemed to strain toward the floor, their mouths open wider, their eyes fixed on the intruders. One of the priests later wrote that he recognized a face, the son of his sister, lost the previous winter. The chapel was sealed again the next morning. No explanation was given, and Aurelio, he was seen only once more in public, crossing the piazza at dusk, his hands bare, his gaze fixed not on the cobbles before him, but somewhere far above, as if measuring a ceiling no one else could see. After that, he vanished entirely, leaving behind the locked chapel, the painted angels, and a city that could never decide whether it had harbored a saint, a monster, or both. Decades passed, and the city of Cremona moved on as cities do, its cobbled streets wearing thin under the tread of generations, its secrets buried beneath layers of dust and indifference. The chapel of Santa Lucia remained locked, its heavy doors barricaded against both the curious and the faithful. The fresco overhead faded beneath the shadows of neglect. Yet the angels, once radiant, seemed only to deepen their gaze, their painted eyes growing darker, more knowing. Aurelio's name, once whispered in fear and awe, slipped into legend, woven between tales of madness and divine vision. The noble families who had lost their children grew old, their faces marked by a rejuvenation none could explain but dared not speak of aloud. The city's authorities left the chapel untouched, an uneasy truce made between memory and silence. Yet those who dared linger beneath the vault at night told stories of music, thin, ethereal strains that wound through the stones like a living breath, the faintest thread of a choir composed of voices lost to time. Centuries later, in the early 1800s, during a period of renovation, the chapel was reopened to the public. Art historians marveled at Aurelio's technique, at the intricate brushwork and haunting realism. Yet many reported feeling unsettled, a cold presence that seemed to ripple through the air. Visitors swore that in the quiet moments, when the sun dipped low, the angels' faces shifted imperceptibly, smiles curling into grimaces, eyes wet with tears, not of paint but of something far older. The fresco was preserved and displayed, studied under microscopes, the skull motifs catalogued with scientific precision. But those who delved into the archives uncovered the vermilion-bound manuscript, stained with bone, and found the list of names with chilling annotations beside them. Singing now, eternal witness, keeper of the harmony. The notion of a choir took on a spectral dimension, a congregation of souls trapped between paint and pigment, their voices woven forever into Aurelio's masterpiece. Somewhere deep in the crypt beneath Santa Lucia, recent restorations revealed fragments of child-sized shoes, delicate bones, embedded beneath the stonework traces of the vanished, memorials of a pact whose price was never paid in coin, but in flesh and song. The local legends persist, that on certain nights, if the wind is just so, you can hear the fragile voices rising in a lament that defies mortality itself. A choir of angels, painted in blood and bone, singing for a city that forgot the cost of beauty. And so the tale ends where it began, in the twilight between devotion and despair, where the brushstrokes of a mad genius locked innocence in eternal song, a baroque requiem for children, stolen and voices silenced yet never truly gone. The chapel stands a monument to a truth too terrible to name, a cathedral not of light but of shadows and echoes, where the painter's brush sings on in the silence, and the choir beneath the paint waits patiently for those who dare to listen.